Welcome, everyone, to our anti-debate about God. Yep, we're going there. Specifically, our anti-debate question for today is, under what circumstances, if any, is it helpful for individuals and societies to believe in God, irrespective of whether God exists? I'm your host, Stephanie Lepp. And for those of you listening, please know that the anti-debate is hereby available for your use. So if you are a podcast host or an educator or anyone who kind of wants to do a debate, but different, but ultimately wants to engage people of different perspectives in a productive and generative way, please adapt the anti-debate for your purposes. At the time of this recording, I do not have a URL to offer you, but if you follow me on X at Steph Lepp, you will find what you need. With that, I'm gonna give us a bit of an intro here. I'm gonna introduce our participants, give some context on the topic of our anti-debate, give some context on the phenomenon of the anti-debate, and then we will dive in. So starting with our participants, our anti-debaters today will be Layman Pascal and Jim Rutt, arguing for more permissive circumstances in which people should believe in God, or it would be helpful for people to believe in God, is Layman Pascal, a philosopher, writer, and podcast host. Among his many roles, Layman is the host of the Integral Stage podcast and a co-editor at Perspectiva, an organization that has also undertaken an anti-debate endeavor. So welcome, Layman.
Good to be here.
All right, arguing for more limited circumstances in which it would behoove people to believe in God is Jim Rutt, an entrepreneur, systems thinker, and also a podcast host. Among his many roles, Jim is the former chairman of the Santa Fe Institute and the current host of the Jim Rutt Show. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, good to be here.
All right, so now let's get some context on the topic of our anti-debate. For our purposes today, God is defined as a proposed ultimate source of existence and value. A proposed ultimate source of existence and value. And again, the question that we're exploring is, under what circumstances, if any, is it helpful for individuals and societies to believe in God, irrespective of whether God exists? Notice this question invites us to set aside the question of whether God exists and instead focus on the functional impacts of belief in God. And belief systems range from, just to give us a sense, range from theistic views, which believe in God, to non-literal views, which consider God a useful fiction, all the way to different flavors of skepticism like agnosticism, like who knows, and atheism, so belief in God's non-existence. And we will be examining how that range of belief systems might benefit or harm individuals and societies psychologically, socially, and culturally. So finally, a little bit of context on the phenomenon of the anti-debate. So the goal of the anti-debate, and here among us, is not to change minds, but to expand minds. The goal is for everyone, Layman, Jim, and all of you listening, to walk away with a more comprehensive understanding of the topic of debate. In this case, a more comprehensive understanding of the considerations around when belief in God might be helpful. So put simply, the anti-debate is a debate that everyone can win. In that spirit, by agreeing to participate in this anti-debate, Jim and Layman have agreed to the following 3 terms, so we can hold them accountable. First, they've agreed to engage in good faith communication, dialogue, i.e. dialogue with a genuine intention to understand each other's perspectives, share their own views honestly, and seek mutual understanding. Second, they've agreed to practice epistemic humility, i.e. balance their confidence in prior ideas with openness to new ideas, and to upgrade their beliefs in the face of new information. And finally, they've agreed to abide by the format as I guide them through it. Our anti-debate will have 3 phases. Phase 1 is about clarifying the different perspectives, so it will sound somewhat like a traditional debate, right, with opening statements and rebuttals. Phase two is where things will get a little more interesting, where Layman and Jim will steelman each other's perspectives and explore how they might integrate their different perspectives into a more comprehensive view. Hence the tagline of the anti-debate: first debate, then co-create. And finally, phase three is where we'll take stock of what we learned. So with that, let's dive into phase one, starting with personal stories. So as a way for Layman and Jim to connect before getting into the content, they are each going to share a personal story related to the issue of God or spirituality more broadly. So Jim, we will start with your personal story. You have 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
Hold on just a second here, get my timer up. That damn phone.
I'll time for you, but
When I
feel
was a
free
kid,
to as
when I
well.
was a kid, I was raised a Catholic, although I didn't attend Catholic elementary school like many of my friends. Instead, I went to Sunday school, what was called CCD in those days, and we went to Mass every Sunday. And I was actually fairly devout, particularly in fourth grade, under the influence of a very serious and compelling teacher named Mr. McMillan. If you're out there still, howdy. Around that time, inspired by the changes wrought by Vatican II, he encouraged us to actually read the Old Testament, something Catholics didn't used to do. I found it fascinating, dense, intricate, with stories operating on multiple levels. I ended up reading the entire Old Testament, which gave me a rather broader sense of religion as a whole. At the same time, I'd long been fascinated by science ever since I was about 5. Instead of buying comic books like my friends, I saved my money for kids' science booklets on things like reptiles, gemstones, the solar system, chemistry. In first grade, our teachers wouldn't let us check out anything other than the little kids' storybooks at the library. But I found if I snuck in after school, they didn't know how old I was. I was tall for my age. I could take out chemistry books, astronomy books, theology books, and I devoured them all. As I continued to grow up, I started reading science fiction, and then I started to notice a growing tension between my religious upbringing and my scientific outlook. Then came the summer before 7th grade. In those days, that was a big deal. In elementary school, we had one teacher all day. Teacher kept a pretty eagle eye on us, etc. Junior high school, as it was known in those days, was a lot more like high school, where you had 6 or 7 classes, different teachers, you roamed the hall between them, etc. And you had a hell of a lot of independence. I would say, as it turned out, too much independence for age 11, but hey, that's another story for another day, or I can tell you some hair-raising stories. And that transition was often thought to be wrought. People would want, can I deal with it? Oh my God. I was always a confident dude. I wasn't too worried about it, but there were definitely some people that had lots of trepidation. So anyway, that summer, I decided to investigate this tension between science and religion more seriously. And I got my parents to haul me to the county library several times, and I found a thick book on comparative religions, and I read a bunch of it. I then made a list of the religions I thought were significant, and I went and read encyclopedia entries on each one. And being a good proto-scientist, I read 2 encyclopedia entries on each religion, including, as I recall, various brands of Protestantism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and even Mongolian and Native American traditions. After pondering it all for a few weeks, I had an epiphany. These beliefs seem to have in common that they were created by humans and used to influence or control other humans. Over the years, I've refined that view to recognize that religions may start with a visionary or charismatic individual, but then they've inevitably grown and evolved over time, eventually becoming tools of power for some. I've never really shifted from that idea that they're human inventions, yet I remain captivated by elaborate and magical narratives. Lord of the Rings, which I've read 35 times, for example, I read it recently 3 months ago. I appreciate its fictional world the same way I can appreciate the
Jim,
Old Testament for its literary
as
depth.
much as I don't want to.
I only had one more
Sorry,
sentence.
was that your last sentence? Then finish
One
it.
more
Finish it.
sentence. The key
Okay.
difference, understanding that these stories, however inspiring, are not literal truth claims, but powerful works of the imagination.
All right. Thank you, Jim. And we will definitely want to hear those other stories some other time. All right, Layman, over to you.
Okay. The island where I grew up had a little public school, A.J. Elliott Elementary, grades 1 through 7, with about 100 kids in total. But there was also a Christian school that was in the basement of an old church in town. It had about 3 kids that the rest of us ran into occasionally. They seemed kind of weird, kind of culturally autistic and shut in, but they could still go for hikes and play soccer. And I remember this one kid, Kirk, he and I were walking around one day, and to me, out of nowhere, he starts going off at me about the Ten Commandments. Interesting stuff, but Kirk sounded false to me. He seemed like he was regurgitating something that he had duplicated and wanted me to duplicate. And I said to him, "How could you possibly think you know what God wants?" And he said, "The priest told him." And I said, "How does the priest know?" And he said, "Well, he read it in the magic book." And I said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I don't mind basic moral guidelines, but no God worth honoring would expect me to believe what some guy said that some other guy said that he read in a book. That's just social. That's not religious." I said to him that anything communicated in that manner is basically worthless. But I also said to him that if God came to me personally and mentioned these commandments, I'd be happy to go along with it. And I think my basic attitude hasn't really changed from that moment. The utility of divinity strikes me as something existential and personal and organic that people discover together through activities that bring faithfulness of being. And that this has very little to do with believers or books or the corrupted residue of mythological gossip in the standard sense. I'm very pro God, but for me, God is something you learn at the level beyond superstition and ordinary social categories of reasoning, something that's indifferent to what we call it. I think if your idea of no God has the same qualities as my idea of God, then they're the same thing. Names don't matter. The names are idolatry.
All right, thank you. Thank you both. So hopefully that gives you and our listeners a little bit of a sense of where each other are coming from, which is already, already complex. And, like Jim went deep into his studies of religion as at a young age. And yeah, Layman, you've had a healthy dose of skepticism from a young age too. So all right, so with that, let's move on to opening statements. Layman, since you're arguing for more permissive circumstances in which it would behoove people to believe in God, let's start with your opening statements. You have 6 minutes. Take it away.
Okay, I'm on the side of many circumstances. I think there's a wide range of diverse, useful affirmations of God for both individuals and societies. I don't think it's particularly useful for cynics who think they're cultural elites to try to program or bully people into a shared belief claim to get them to do certain social projects, but I will give a few examples of the many places I think the God idea is functional and possibly necessary. For individuals, I'm kind of on the side of Descartes and the philosophers. I like this idea that our ability to live in a way that meaningfully embodies our values is partly dependent upon our relationship to the experience of maximal value, supreme value, the valuableness of our values, and that there's this ever-present possibility of optimal validation that exceeds all the particular and contingent values in the same way that the Great Spirit exceeds all the particular elements of an imaginal pantheon. I think that what stabilizes and complexifies individuals is their growth of understanding, and that the growth of understanding depends on generating or accessing a kind of surplus meaningful coherence that outshines our current field of perception and cognition and values. So it's mysterious, it's more real than real, it's edifying, and it can reflect back at us in many ways, including and legitimately in the form of a virtual great person. This phenomenon, to which we attach transcendental signifiers like the word God, could be experienced as a force or an event or a higher self, but it can also be experienced as if it was an authentic other. And that's useful. It reminds and entrains humans to validate the other and hold open what Martin Buber called the I thou relationship, because it prompts a positive unfolding relationship with the abstract prototype of the valued other, what the Sufis call the beloved. Another use is that the transcendental signifier God allows us to name and inspect a key anchoring principle in our sense-making system. Nietzsche said we'll never be rid of God as long as we have faith in grammar. And to me, that means that something like what we call God is an intrinsic element of our participatory cognitive syntax. We can be blithe about that, but we can't actually opt out. When Nietzsche's madman confronts the atheists and tells them they have no idea what the death of God would really mean, he chastises them for thinking they can just decide not to believe, because that doesn't fundamentally change their relationship to the horizon of meaning. They still have something godlike in their processing mechanism. And now, in some ways, they're even dumber because they can't or don't want to acknowledge that. They just pretend it's been taken care of already. So there's God as part of how we can be honest about our relationship to the field of symbolic processing. Socially, I would say that we're often unnecessarily disrespectful of our ancestors when we disavow the concept of God. Maybe many of our ancestors were dummies, but many also were wise, and they regularly found it necessary to communicate and frame things around the notion of a great spirit. So, in the mode of Chesterton's fence, I'm not just going to throw that out, especially when it's so socially powerful going forward still. If we're working toward the alliances that are necessary to upgrade civilization, then I think we need to become at ease with and be able to use with a good conscience the God language, because it's so pertinent to and significant for so many of the traditions and the worldview languages that we have to deal with. It seems to me doubtful that we can coordinate a sufficient mass of people without the concept of God. And personally, I don't like giving up the battlefield before the battle. I think that if somebody talking about God sounds like an idiot, I don't want to let them be the definer to which I am counter proposing myself as the non believer. I want to be the definer and tell the idiot that he's wrong about what he thinks the word God means. But really, I think the most profound social utility is what I would call something like excess numinous interpersonal coherence. When they say a god or a spirit circulates among us wherever two or three of us gather in its name, I think that phenomenon is necessary for transformative cultural mobilization. We have a lot of shared problems. We also have a lot of potential solutions, but we don't collectively do anything because, in general, we lack a shared energy and a shared motivational meaning that exceeds business as usual behavioral investments. So that's like saying it's not enough to be pagan. You do have to remember the living God. We need to co-cultivate an attunement to a shared ethos that feels viscerally excessive and maximally valuable so that we can mobilize to reorganize our entrenched investments. Something we hold in common as if it were a real entity that is more valuable than our current values. That's what the transcendental signifier names. I think we need this possibility in order to upgrade ourselves as a civilization. So as something like a prophet in the global village, I'm quite comfortable saying that we're not going to solve the meta crisis unless we get right with the Lord. And there's a little snapshot cluster of some of the reasons why I think God is a valuable thing for people to attune to.
Sweet. Thank you. Thank you. And I imagine that last, what did you call it? Excess numinous coherence? What did you
Interpersonal
call it?
coherence, something like that.
Excess numinous interpersonal coherence. Okay, that's going to be one that Jim is probably interested in anti-debating you about. Jim, you'll both have the chance to offer a rebuttal, but for now, Jim, you will have 6 minutes for your opening statement. So go for it.
All right, our topic is under what circumstances, if any, is it helpful for individuals and society to believe in God, irrespective of whether God exists? When I look at that statement, the thing that stands out is circumstances. I can enumerate both benefits and costs for belief in God, which I will get into. And so we need to look at a given set of circumstances and see what the net of the negatives and positives of belief in God are, and understand what circumstances we are in at any given time, and make at least a rough estimate on whether the belief in God is a net good or a net bad. Another historical utility from belief in God, started out, I think, with an attempt at a coherent explanation of the world. we seem to want coherence in our understandings. And when we have no idea why the moon goes through phases and why animals migrate and why there's seasons and things like that, not having any such explanations is extraordinarily stressful. And so religion served the very useful purpose of providing explanations. It also provided a moral framework. And remember, in the old days, we didn't have records of previous moral frameworks or non-religious moral frameworks. So religious moral frameworks seemed to be the only ones on offer, and they were better than nothing, better than the nihilistic alternative. Certainly there was benefit from the policeman in the sky, or what I call the Santa Claus effect, where the belief that some superior entity is watching us all the time. So maybe we act more morally even when there's no one around to watch. That's certainly a benefit. And then anthropologists have identified communal identity and cohesion, which makes groups more efficacious, willing to fight and die for each other, etc. And such cohesive communities can outcompete less unified groups. And so, religion enhanced cooperation contributed to the success in intergroup conflicts, and the more efficacious of such mimetics basically would propagate. If we think about the downsides, however, a lot of these explanations for the universe were just flat wrong. They're archaic or incorrect. No, thunder didn't cause by Thor hitting a metal sheet with his hammer. And of course, some of these moral perspectives may have made sense in their time, but may well be obsolete. For instance, it was probably a good idea not to eat seafood in the Middle East 3,500 years ago before refrigeration. It's a good way to die. Probably not such a bad idea going to your favorite shellfish bar in New York City today, right? A little bit more controversial, perhaps, is premarital sex might have been not necessarily the greatest idea in the days before birth control, with convenient 99.5% successful birth control. Premarital sex may be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And if you anchor these things in religion and God, quote unquote, they're much harder to change. They become rigid and produces unnecessary guilt and stifling of individual freedom. I would also suggest that it's infantilizing. We basically outsource to God the idea of moral reasoning and the definition of what is a good life for humanity. And it's in conflict with our modern ideals of individual autonomy and personal sovereignty. We should also note, of course, the side effects. The same cohesion that produces success against outsiders also leads to wars, inquisitions, and genocide tied to religion. Long and hideous list of such things. And particularly in the modern age, in the era of weapons of mass destruction, probably been no net winning wars for any side since 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. Continuing this idea of fighting over beliefs is highly destructive and just an insane idea. So let's compare and contrast the epoch and the circumstances where religion might be a net benefit to the contexts where it's probably a net harm. Where we have limited scientific knowledge, the coherence of understanding the universe and our place in it's a plus. Where we don't remember competing in other philosophical systems, having a philosophical and moral system is probably better than not having one. Where slow and mostly oral communications made large scale coherence difficult. A simply explained story like God is a way to get large scale coherence. And as I said before, maybe the only real source of moral and existential meaning for people. In the modern context, of course, we have scientific progress. We know why the stars rotate in the phases of the moon. We even understand more or less how life works. We have stories about cosmology that are reasonably well supported. We know many ethical systems that are not religious: Stoicism, Aristotelian virtue, Confucianism. There's a long list of moral systems that have nothing to do with gods or religion. So we know it's possible to be moral without gods. And we have institutional structures like courts, law enforcement, credit systems that replace the god policeman in the sky. And I'd suggest the tipping point occurred around 1790, what we think of as the Enlightenment thinking, that emphasized reason, individual rights, and secular governance. birth of new social and political orders that showed that societies could thrive without theocratic norms, the US Constitution being a great example. And of course, that's accelerated in the modern world. And today we have a huge rate of change where the anchoring effects of religion, which may have been good in the past, now become extremely destructive when where our society is headed is far different from where our society had been. So all the negatives now compound as we move into this exponentially accelerating future.
Thank you, Jim. And I appreciate that you both have already done some outlining of the circumstances in which it may or may not be helpful to believe in God. So, but I'm going to give you the opportunity to offer your rebuttals. So, Layman, hope you took good notes. You have 3 minutes. Over to you.
Yeah, I like and agree with a lot of what Jim said. The places where I felt a little bit polarized were around um, the difficulty of actually evaluating what's appropriate for a given circumstance. There's a lot of variables, and we only select a few of them to make that evaluation. And it may be that that in itself is a good reason to hold out something as a meta circumstantial value that can anchor the way we make evaluations across multiple circumstances. I would say that the definition of religion that I use is a kind of integrating and unfolding of all the different genres of human knowledge production, and that for it to be a living religion, it has to be up to date. So when a religion uses science from another era, like a church is still using the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic worldview, it's not actually being the religion of today, it's being the religion of the Middle Ages. So that a religion of today would enfold today's science, today's issues, things like that. It would continue to do the same religionization activity that it anciently did. So I don't think it's totally fair to consider the non-updated residual pseudo-religions to be actual contemporary instantiations of religion. Then the other thing that stuck out to me was the kind of argument that someone like Greg Henriquez makes around the Enlightenment gap, that although we did undertake this upgrade at the time of the Enlightenment, we also broke certain things. We made it difficult to solve a lot of our social and psychological problems collectively because of some of the very mechanisms we implemented at the time of the Enlightenment. And in order to resolve those, we may have to do something that looks a lot more like religion and God than it has for the last couple of hundred years. So that's just a couple of points.
Great. Thank you. Jim, over to your rebuttal.
Yeah, from layman's perspective and his God, I couldn't really make out if his God was anything or just a word. You know, was it nominalism, right? And I read the paper that he wrote, which he submitted to us, and when I finished reading that, I'm still not sure if Layman actually believed in a person, or whether he was like Spinoza, I would argue, labeling as God something that was the universe, right? The holon of all existence. And so I'm not entirely sure that layman's God is a God in the sense that most people would consider a God. So that would be one rebuttal and comment. And then I would also suggest that the things that you were talking about, the holes, right, that were clearly left in man with the death of God. You know, the story that John Vervaeke says in his Meaning Crisis video series, I think is absolutely correct. But I would say that I stick with Vervaeke, which is that that hole is real and is cognitive and psychological and cultural, but it doesn't have to be filled with God, right? Vervaeke himself does a great job of enumerating the kinds of practices and traditions and group coherences, singing together, something as simple as that, which many religions have had, has a known psychological effect that we now can study and know that it helps build group coherences. So it strikes me that layman's fairly diffuse God and the whole that he identifies correctly may not need need to be filled with God, but may need to be filled with well-thought, well-crafted practices. With respect to the Chesterton's fence argument, which is the idea that don't tear down a fence, you don't know why it was there. So essentially an argument for tradition. To my point earlier, that as we're accelerating in our capacities as humans, the utility of views from the past gets smaller and smaller. Not to say that in some cases Chesterton's fence isn't correct, but I would argue that the sheer between where we are and where we were is getting greater and greater year by year. And hence the reliance on, the essentially basically conservative argument of Chesterton's fence is less and less relevant, though not non-relevant. So you have to just tune your equation as we're accelerating into the future.
All right. So we actually can now just open it up to 10 minutes of unstructured debate. Feel free to go back and forth. I am going to ask you, Layman, to at least respond to, what do you mean by God, and how do you know, or to what extent, how would you know if the God-shaped hole does it need to be filled with God, or what does it need to be filled with, and how would you know that? But yeah, the floor is open.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of semantics here, right? I mean, I think I would be tempted to make an argument like whatever fills the God-shaped hole is the definition of God. And that different societies and different thinkers put different things in that hole, but God names whatever fills that hole. It's a structural phenomenon of some kind. And some people have filled that hole in ways that are more poetic and imaginal and mythological. We now don't have to rely on that approach as much. But that's roughly how I think of God, right? It names a phenomenon that humans can co-produce with themselves, with nature, with each other. It's a very useful phenomenon, and it's the phenomenon that I treat the word God as pointing at, but I also think of all words only as kind of rough pointers in the direction of general phenomenological experiences of some kind. I really appreciate the degree to which Chesterton's fence might need to be tweaked as we enter into circumstances that are more and more different than the ones in which our ancestors emerged. I might mitigate that a little bit with a kind of Nassim Taleb argument, which is that as things become very turbulent and have very outsized outcomes, we may need to rely on heuristics that have been preserved over long periods of different kinds of situations, just because we can't predict in the new, it's like this new thing is not just more different than the past, it's also in some ways more difficult to anticipate, and that might be a reason to fall back on ancient heuristics.
All right. Well, let me respond to the idea that whatever fills the God-shaped hole is God. Well, the first thing that filled the God-shaped hole, maybe not the first thing, the thing that filled it in the 60s and the 70s was sex and drugs, rock and roll, and booze, right? So are they God? I think that's a pretty weak argument, or at least it produces a very nominalist variety of God. Whatever fills that hole is God. And then we looked at what, the ideas of Vervaeke, the religion is not a religion, things like martial arts, singing together, meditation, conviviality, true love, ecstatic sex. Are those things God? I don't think so. I mean, they don't strike me as fitting at least the common idea of God. They are ways of life. And this is where I'm working and where my beliefs head, is that what should fill the God-shaped hole is institutions and personal chains that spiral together to produce a new way of living that's high dimensional and rich and beyond the naive Newtonism of the Enlightenment. So I do believe that the early Enlightenment was way what's the right word, naive, and that as we understand complexity and the fact that complex systems are not easily predictable, we need to have a much different approach to reality. And in fact, I'm going to introduce a term which I recently started using, which is the sacred. And I'm using it in my own way, which is that the sacred is an appropriate way to approach very high dimensional systems that are entirely or almost entirely uncomputable. So as a simple example, Mother Nature. the wonderful robustness and generativeness of our natural world. We don't really understand it. We can't calculate it. We can do some simple modeling, et cetera. But if we make changes, we don't know what the impact of those changes will be. And so I've suggested that without any gods, that we as humans, in building a social operating system for the future, approach things like Mother Nature with a sacredness, understanding that it's too complex for us to attempt to understand analytically how to dork with it without producing adverse effects. And so we use heuristics and our personal intuitions, which we have been evolved for, 7 million years approximately from where we branched off from the chimps, to be able to process things non-linearly with our brains, both our right brains and our left brains, and we're pretty good at it. And so if we learned to approach nature with our intuitive being rather than our analytical, sort of reductionist, materialist kinds of, like, how many board feet can I get out of this forest, versus understanding that there's a great richness in this forest that far transcends its material benefits. I think we can build much better institutions and ways of being by using sacredness without any supernatural aspects.
Before we get into that, because I have a feeling there will be some agreement there and you'll be able to find each other, I just want to just clarify a little further where there might be differences and distinctions. And Layman, I want to ask you what you think it is, if anything, and granted, this might be exactly what Jim means by the sacred, but what you think it is about belief in God in particular, or whatever you like, belief in the transcendent. What is unique about that? What about that offers something? Is there something about that offers something that non-transcendent belief cannot provide?
I don't think about this as an argument about claims about what exists in the world or outside the world. I think about this as a phenomenon that human beings have been experiencing, that they've named God, and they've also named it a variety of different things, and we could call it anything we liked. But it's important to have symbols that directly point toward the transcendental phenomenon so that we can help organize our thinking around that and participate toward generating and accessing that for ourselves and with each other.
Yeah, I would.
It's like saying, what's the usefulness if you're going out in the woods looking for mushrooms? What's the usefulness of having a concept of a mushroom? It helps you look for it.
Yeah, I would
Where do
argue
you draw
that
the line, though, between mushroom and not mushroom?
It's always going to be a slightly negotiated line in your perceptual field and with other people. And it's no different when we're talking about God than it is when we're talking about any other phenomenon. Where do you draw the line in terms of what constitutes a war or a peace or a relationship, right? It's just normal parameters of sense making. It's not specific to the God issue, that flexibility.
Right. But then how could we make a case for more permissive circumstances or more limited? Like, you got to have some sense of what it is in order to make the case that.
Right. And so I'm describing what it is. It's a
Okay.
certain kind of phenomenology whereby people experience something, a meaningful coherence that outshines their perceptual field. It's not, you don't just put things in the God hole, it fills up the God hole. It overflows in your experience. It's like, oh, my direct experiential field contains an element that I'm relating to that is in excess of everything else and seems like it is the source or epitome of value itself. And it's a terrific experience. It justifies existence in the moment of having that experience. And by naming it or thinking about it and by associating it with historical discourses around the transcendental signifier, we can help clarify our efforts to have more of that experience. And I would say, to Jim's point earlier, sex, drugs, and rock and roll is a perfectly viable attempt under certain reasons, right? There's occult traditions, there's tantric traditions. These are all part of the traditional human relationship to God that isn't quarantined in mainstream churches. It's a much broader, more general phenomenon that can show up in all kinds of places that might not seem attractive to conventional downtown religionists.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I will, first preamble by saying, hey, I've done psychedelics on several occasions. I've had numerous mystical experiences. I know how to induce mystical experiences in most people. Give me 36 hours and I'll give you a mystical experience. However, the word you used, which I wrote down on my piece of paper and underlined, is seems to provide a sense of something or other. And I think the correct word is seems. My own insights into the phenomena of mysticism, psychedelics being out there in some ways, is that they're internal brain states which seem to be profound, but actually aren't. I mean, they're profound in the sense that they are highly memorable and they're, exclamation points in your brain, and hence they're actually very useful for your maturation as a mature person. In fact, I have advocated, I'm sure this is highly controversial, that as a senior in high school, you should do 2 acid trips. One, a 50 or 75 microgram, sort of light initiation trip, and then a 400 microgram ego death trip as part of your graduation ceremony to give you this explanation point and open your brain up to the fact that your brain and the world is stranger than you might think. But I am as certain as I am of anything that it doesn't produce any new truths. It doesn't bring in anything from the outside. It's merely a very clever, interesting, and fun sometimes, and terrifying other times, remix of what you already have. And so the sense that it seems to provide a deep grounding in anything, I think, is a hallucination and our confabulation about our own powerful experiences.
Yeah, I would say that yes, it's a hallucination, but there's a hallucinatory element to all perceptions, and they're variably useful. Um, that to me seems describes what I would think of as a viable contemporary kind of metaphysics, right? That religion that was based on a simple metaphysics of empirical observation and identities are totally themselves has been giving way over the last couple hundred years to a metaphysics that's a little bit looser, a little bit more intrinsically relational, multi-contextual, that's trying to take into account the participatory co-construction of the way we elicit data from the reality around us. So for me, seems is just a statement that something exists, right? Everything that exists is what seems to exist. Now, I think it's very difficult to say specifically what extra information you would get from this thing I'm calling the God phenomenon. But I don't think we can rule out that there's some objective co-creative experience there, just like there's an objective co-creative element to my experience of a tree. I'm not experiencing most of it, but something about the way that the tree impresses me with its coherence and the vividness with which I experience it is partly hallucinatory on my part, but it also gives me some relational and behavioral insights into how to treat some objective aspect of reality. And I think it's well within the realm of possibility that the God experience does that as well. And it may be that it applies more generally than the tree, but I think it does I think there's a likelihood, and we don't know the nature of that likelihood, that it does in fact give us some information through the approximate and quasi hallucinatory process of doing any kind of perception.
It may well give us some insights that we can't get to otherwise. But I do believe there's been quite a large amount of experiment to see if there is any net new information. And the answer is always no, just as the evidence of the efficacy of anonymous prayer. Templeton Foundation has funded a lot. That's quite humorous. Hundreds of people praying for you. If you know they're praying for you, it may have an effect, psychologically placebo effect. But if you don't know, it doesn't. They also did a very interesting experiment where they brought a bunch of nuns and a bunch of recently paroled ex-cons to a casino and see who had better luck. And the answer was identical, right? So, and they're looking. Their part of their charter is to find these spiritual things. In fact, I think they offer a $5 million prize if you can prove the existence of spiritual anything. But so far, the results are nope, it's all inside our own heads, which is okay. And which is why I think that things like practices can be very, very helpful. Things like psychedelics can be helpful. Things like sex and drugs and rock and roll can be helpful, but not because they tap into a person or a force or something, but because they remix what we have in our brains and give us new insights that we otherwise might not have.
So to me, that
So,
points to the need for a better class of priests, let's say, right? And we could frame that and phrase that a number of different ways, but I think there's a human tendency to oversimplify and over reify and to think magically about all kinds of dimensions of life unless there's social supports around them to encourage them to think in a more complex and reasonable way about it. And I think we need like something like a priesthood and also the kind of stories, the prophets always come to people who still think they're religious and tell them they've strayed from the path, right? That they've taken the concepts and they've over reified them and now they're using them foolishly and magically. So I think if we have appropriate supports in the way we think about God, then it can continue to be a very useful goad to our own transformations and experiences and growth.
Yeah, let me compare that and contrast it. God as a scratch pad for thinking about the good, right? Or thinking about right living or right organization or whatever. I would also compare that with Gandalf and Frodo from Lord of the Rings, right? I actually use them occasionally as good moral exemplars in a very difficult situation, high dimensional, difficult situation. And I suspect I get more actually useful insights in thinking about Gandalf and Frodo than I do thinking about God, who to me is just some strange abstraction that probably doesn't exist that people hallucinate about. And so I would say that if I can get useful moral insights from Frodo and Gandalf, then are Frodo and Gandalf God? And if so, then I would say, then fine. I'm happy to buy that God is our extractions from great literary stories.
do you have a
Are
response
we
to that,
are
Layman?
we on track for you, Steph? Should we
We
keep
are,
going or
we're
are
a
we
little,
switching?
well, I want to, we're gonna head into phase 2 in a second, but I'm gonna just throw in a question and see where it takes us. So, that we haven't really talked about the research on this question of to what extent can we even say is there data that shows a correlation between religious belief and moral behavior. And Jim sent something by cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett that he's written that no significant positive correlation has been made between religious belief and moral behavior. I looked at some other studies that show a very small but statistically significant positive correlation. But ultimately, the data is complex. If there is a modest relationship, it's highly dependent on context. And so I think the jury is kind of out on this one. And so I guess the question I would ask before we go into phase 2 is just on what basis can we even kind of make a case about whether, circumstances should be more expansive or more contracted?
Actually, I do have some data, which I researched for this anti-debate, which is
All right.
I had ChatGPT Pro do a deep research on the correlation between religiosity and various antisocial indicators in US states. And it turned out there was a modest negative correlation. The higher the religiosity, the higher the crime rate, the divorce rate, the out of wedlock birth rate, and I believe mental illness rate. They weren't huge, but they were significant correlations such that the higher the religiosity in a state, the higher the negative aspects were, which I would say at a minimum puts a stop to the argument that religiosity is good. However, to anticipate layman's obvious rebuttal, the kind of religiosity we're talking about is God in the sky, kind of archaic, fundamentalist, because no surprise, the answer is the South is high in all these things: religiosity, crime, divorce, you name it. It has it all.
Yeah, it's a very complex thing to think about the relationship between, I think, God and moral behavior. There's a famous, I think it's from Dostoevsky, if God isn't real, then everything is permitted. The idea that if you don't have this sort of moral pinnacle in your mind, then what would allow you to guide your behavior from values in general? But there's a reciprocal argument that the philosopher Slavoj Žižek makes all the time, which is if God is real, then everything is permitted, which is to say, if your group thinks it has access to an overwhelming truth of some kind, that gives it permission to do basically anything and think that they're justified. So you can make those arguments either way. From the way that I think about the meaning of God, I would say that what you need are some kinds of mature, sophisticated priests or actual developmental and esoteric figures in your community who help people go through the practices and the rites and the interpersonal relating that lead to the development of goodness and moral growth, both in its potency and its nuance. And when people go through that together, they often have an experience of a numinous, shared, super valuable presence, which is, I think, pretty instinctively what a lot of us would point at as being God once we've separated that from any kinds of arguments about specific instantiations or names or storybook characters. And I think fictional characters like Frodo and Gandalf can be great examples of that process.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say they're
Okay, so
God, but I
perhaps
think
there's
they could be good demigods or high priests or something like that.
so
Of course,
maybe there's
Gandalf
a
actually was a
redrawing.
Gandalf actually was a demigod in the mythology of Middle Earth. He was a Maya, which was a secondary god, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Another data
So,
point. Let me
oh,
get on the data here while we're staying on the data.
okay, we'll give you 1 more minute for data, and then I should move us into phase 2. Yes.
All right. And that is, if we look around the world, generally the most civilized, highest quality of life, and highest happiness indexes are in Northern Europe. Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, etc. And they are also the lowest in religiosity. The places with the highest religiosity, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Middle East, score very low on well-being and human happiness. So I would say empirically, it's not at all clear that the abandonment of religion is bad for people.
All right. It feels like, there may be a redrawing of the axes here from God, not God, to a more specific meaning, which may be what Jim means by the sacred. We'll get to that, but we're gonna now shift into phase 2. And now that you've kind of clarified your own different perspectives, although I think there's a little more clarifying to do, but maybe the steel manning will help do that. I'm going to give you the opportunity to steel man each other. So one at a time, you will each articulate such a strong version of each other's perspective that it could convince even you. And I want to be really clear that you're not like picking the parts of each other's argument that you like the best. You are speaking the other person's perspective as if it's your own and ideally strengthening it. So you're not going to say, I think that he's saying XYZ. You're just going to say XYZ. And then the other person will have the chance to correct anything you didn't get right. So Jim, let's start with you. You have 3 minutes to steelman layman's perspective. Go for it.
Well, it's clear from looking at history and our own experiences that humans always find God, that they, in various ways, experience the numinous and the transcendent, and that has been a source of great value to humanity since the beginning. And it would be very foolish for us to discard what is essentially a universal human phenomenon in the face of crack-brained, new thinking that says, "Oh, there is no God," right? To yell God, no God, God is dead in the public square. Further, we have strong reason to believe, because essentially every coherent society has believed in God, that this is an important part, not only for our human personal well-being, our need to fill that God-shaped holes we talk about, but also as an organizing principle for coherence and identity across societies. And that societies in which belief starts to atrophy are societies that are decaying and breaking up into discoherent compartments. That the way forward really should be for us to develop practices and people, particularly highly skilled shaman, who can help guide us to a form of filling our God-shaped hole that is not incongruent with the modern situation that we're in. That we don't believe in necessarily the thunder gods of the old books, but we do believe that they were echoing something that's real, that's important for humanity, and we should not abandon that. Instead, we should use our skills and our best reasoning, our best thinking to upgrade that, and in particular, find people who can help us resonate with a form of God that is not irrational and unbelievable in our current circumstance.
Nice. Layman, what do you think?
I'm sold. Sign me up to Jim's religion.
All right. Cool. Well, Layman, over to you. You have 3 minutes to make the most compelling possible case for Jim's position.
Okay. Evaluating the usefulness of people believing in God depends very much on doing specific calculus for various circumstances. And the main difference of circumstances we see is between the knowledge and technology of the contemporary world and the knowledge and situation of the ancient world. In the knowledge and situation of the ancient world, you can make a pretty strong argument that the notion of God helped organize society, helped organize people's thinking, maybe helped them be a little bit more moral in their behavior because they felt like they were being inspected by some great entity. But the situation we're facing now is so complex and so quickly transforming and so knowledge rich that those forms of imaginal scaffolding for our social organization really don't apply in any significant way anymore. That the perpetuation of outdated explanations not only inhibits our development individually and socially, but it creates forms of guilt and unreason that sabotage our intellectual and emotional development and keep us in some ways infantilized and lacking agency as beings. I think the experiences people have of God are fundamentally not objective but subjective in their significance, but that subjectivity points to a role that they could play if they were taken more lightly and less dogmatically in personal and artistic and social affairs. And that there is something in our society that's insufficient without the cultivation of a sense of the sacred. And we need to be able to get beyond reductive reasoning, but this sense of the sacred has to be understood as creative and science friendly and permeable and non-dogmatic and fundamentally different from any kinds of religious superstition that we use to help organize ourselves in the human past.
Exactly.
All right. Impressive. Well, so that was so that was an attempt to kind of plug holes in each other's positions, or maybe just fully represent them, faithfully represent them. But now you're gonna attempt to poke holes in your own. So one at a time, you'll each answer the question, what would it take to change your position? And the more specific you can be, the better. So Layman, we're going to start with you. You have 3 minutes. what would it take to change your position?
Well, I can think of two things right off the bat, and one is, all right, if I could be shown some statistical evidence from like behavior and neurochemistry that showed that the type of divine experience that I'm talking about is more easily achieved and stabilized in people who minimize their use of the God concept, then I would be persuaded that they should do that, and that we all should, if that was demonstrated to be a more effective way to get this experience. And I think there's a social correlate to that, which is if I could be shown some data that suggested that um, people who organize themselves around the God idea are more amenable to cooperative alliances with people who are authentic about their disbelief than with people who are trying to comport themselves in ways that line up with the God language, then I wouldn't necessarily recommend that we do that. Right. I think it is important to form these alliances between worldviews. And if that can be done in a way that doesn't require people to feel they're going against their own conscience in speaking about their disbelief, that would be fantastic. I would be on board at that point.
All right, wait, can you clarify the second? You said
Okay.
the second
Like
thing you
one of
could
the
be
things I
shown is
talked about
people.
earlier
Yeah,
was the need to feel really comfortable and with a good conscience be able to use God language, because we need to create productive social alliances with people who massively use that language. But if you could show
mm-hmm.
me that you can create alliances that are just as good or better by being authentic about your
Got it.
disbelief or dislike of that concept, well, then we wouldn't need to use that concept as much.
Got it. Great. All right, Jim, would you like to respond to that before you answer the question yourself?
No.
No. Okay. Okay, so Jim,
All
what
right,
would
I
it
got two.
take to change your position? Yes,
I
go.
got to tell you, I'll start out with a real, true, funny story. One of my good friends is a Presbyterian pastor, and she and I love to argue. She loves to argue. She's a former litigating attorney before she had a second career as a pastor. So her and I love to argue. And she asked me one day bluntly, "All right, Jim, what would it take you to believe in Yahweh?" Right? And I said, "All right. Well, I don't believe my own perceptions for the reasons I talked about earlier, hallucinations, mystical experiences, LSD. I've done them all, right? I know that they seem very, very impressive at the time. So this is what I proposed. I said, give me 2 weeks notice, and I'll get 5 film crews, digital film, I guess these days, to show up at the Washington Monument. I want the Washington Monument to take up off the ground 200 feet, rotate 3 times around its vertical axis, and set itself down back on its foundation undamaged at the time that I specified, then I'll believe in your God. Particularly after I look at the 5 videos and see that it shows the same things I thought I saw. And so that's sort of a strong form of, verificationism, a lack of strong substance on the subjective side. I want evidence if I'm going to believe in these kinds of things beyond the natural. And so
But
I
this
think.
isn't belief in God. This is what would it change? What would it
Okay,
take
so
to
the second
change your,
part, well, if I
yeah,
believed in God, then I'd probably believe in the second part, that it was useful to believe.
right.
So here's the second part.
Maybe.
Which is,
Uh-huh.
of course, it could be that God is evil, right? And I occasionally would say that. You read the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, you go, that's a paranoid, schizophrenic motherfucker, right? If he was real, I'd be on the other side, right? And read the book of Joshua for those who really want to understand Yahweh. He's a son of a bitch, right? So in terms of empirical evidence on the other side, if we see the advanced countries that are relatively unreligious, for instance, Scandinavia and the Netherlands, and to some degree the UK and Germany, start to fall apart because of lack of something, then I would have to question my belief that humans are capable of evolving towards solving our social relationships in a way without the God concept. And if, on the flip side, if there's our societies that are very strong in the God concept that start to approach the level of civilization of the Scandinavian countries, then that would be also an argument to reconsider that perhaps there is something in the God concept.
Nice. Jim, or layman, would you like to respond to that at all?
Nope.
No. I mean, is that this is great. This is great to see this out. Is this data available? Is this is something that could be researched and tracked, but for what both of you gave as things that it would take to change your position, right?
I don't specifically know where it's available, but it does seem like information there must be at least some data about out there in terms of the relationship between people's acknowledged relationship to the God concept and how well they're doing as individuals or societies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is some evidence that people's psychological well-being is higher if they believe in God. Whether that's a
Mm.
placebo effect would be my argument, but there is some data out there with respect to the argument I put forth. Yeah, pretty straightforward. You can look at quality of life index, human flourishing indexes, and also then look at religiosity indices, and you will see that the religiosity indices are amongst the lowest in the world in Scandinavia, and the human well-being indexes are amongst the highest in the world.
Right.
And
But
you
then
can
we
look at the
run
same.
into the issue where the religiosity is not actually capturing what we're trying to distinguish here necessarily. Like it's not capturing what you define as the sacred, and it may not be capturing what layman is defining as God either.
Yeah,
So
that is true.
we may not necessarily even actually have data. But so now we're gonna shift into unstructured, just open dialogue. We can talk about Jim's concept of the sacred now. But we're gonna explore how you might integrate your different perspectives into some kind of synthesis. And I actually don't, I was gonna, yeah, I think we can just go at it, but I didn't really let you, layman, respond to what Jim was saying about the sacred earlier. So I wanna let you do that now.
Hmm. Yeah, I do a lot of work around what I call sacred naturalism, which is sort of naturalizing the sacred and sacralizing the natural as complementary moves. So I think that's probably something we're pretty close around. The question I would have around that is how Jim thinks about different modes of interaction with the sacred. So, like coming out of the integral theory background, I often go into things with the assumption that first, second, or third person modes of perceptual and interpretive framing are all valid options. So, my question around the sacred is it necessarily experienced and conceived of as a third person phenomenon? Or is it also a self experience? Is it also an experience of something that's like an other, like an entity that you have a relationship with?
I would say certainly in my case, it is a first person relationship, probably first, right? I was lucky to have grown up, even though it was in an inner suburb. By chance, there was miles of bands of forest that were left. And I spent most of my childhood with my friends exploring those woods and walking into swamps, finding old abandoned springs, capturing turtles and then releasing them at the end of the summer. So my love of nature and my first appreciations of nature are all first person. I was a Boy Scout, all the way up to the oldest age when they kick you out because I love going camping and hiking. And I'm a fisherman and a hunter because those are very interesting and visceral ways to interact with nature. There's very few things that are more spiritual to me to sitting in a deer stand when it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit, sitting absolutely quiet for 4 hours where absolutely nothing happens except the woods slowly coming to life as the sun comes up. So certainly my own experience and probably the grounding of my sense of the sacred is in the first person. And I would say part of what I believe we as humans need is much more experience of people engaged in real nature in the first person to scaffold this higher order third person belief that we must treat nature with great respect and great restraint. I'm not quite sure what a second person relationship would be.
I really, first of all, relate to those same kinds of experiences. I was a Boy Scout and grew up in a pretty remote, forested fishing and farming and hunting community. I think ability to have those experiences in a way that's idiosyncratic and authentic, that really puts individuals in a good position relative to this. If you have enough of those experiences for yourself and in your own way, then you can bring that into discussions with people who deny there's any relevance to the sacred, but you can also bring it into discussions where people who have some prefixed schema of the sacred they want to sell you. So you're in a better bargaining position if you have some experience on which to base those interactions.
A
There's also
question.
kind of,
If
yep.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to refer back to the seams question because to me that's a very important thing. It goes along the lines of epistemic humility. Like I've seemed to see the face of God, right? I've had situations, but it would be less than honest for me to say is. I have to say seems. And I know when I talk to some people who think of themselves as religious that they become anxious around that. They want it to be a totalized assertion to ward off any possible uncertainty that might bedevil them. But I think that that's in the way I would like to phrase religious terms. There's an insufficiency of faith for them, right? That faith is something like your ability to make workable the mystery of existence, and belief is almost like your refusal to try to make the mystery work, your attempt to replace it with a certainty. So I would say to anybody who's watching this who's had experiences or intuitively feels like they have some relationship to God, don't in any way think that opening up to the uncertainty and to the perceptual co creation of these experiences in any way diminishes their power. It might even amplify their power by your clarifying what's real about it by saying a word like seems.
Yeah, I'm happy with seems. It's interesting. I have a tension around the word seems. I can live with the word seems, but I will use it to in a perhaps a different connotation that it's probably not what you think it is. It seems, right? But I'm a agnostic, not an atheist, right? Can't rule out anything, and empirical evidence can validate and bring in any story. And I'm always willing to suspend my disbelief in the face of evidence. Though, as I said earlier, my prior, let's call it, is that these phenomena, of which I've had plenty, are subjective experiences generated in our own brains. But I hold that relatively lightly.
I like the way you situate the sacred very much in ecology, although there's some other options, because I think if you look at the whole human story, that's the longest and most normal way of doing this. And when I try to think about what religion is and what God is, I try to be careful not to over define it according to the period of large mythic membership civilizations, right? If I want to open it up to modern, postmodern, postmodern, I also have to take it back to tribal and archaic and prehistorical modes, which went on for a lot longer than we've had in our few thousand years of recorded history. And so to me, the basic human ways of relating to these phenomenon are fundamentally anchored in the natural environment. We've only been doing it in cities and with books and paper and written language and urban environments for a couple of thousand years. That's a drop in the bucket. The normal way to do the experience of the sacred, whether you think of it as God or not, is to do it in the water, in the woods, with your feet in the dirt.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Har
Yeah.
har. A question.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, yes, yes. Go for it.
I have given that a fair bit of thought, and I agree with you that an awful lot of our thinking is overly anchored in late stage humanity, right? And yes, late stage humanity is extremely impressive. I mean, it's across some line, and there's a whole series of lines. We got writing that changed a lot of things. When we got science that changed a lot of things. When we started to understand complexity, that added a whole nother layer. But the root is this miracle called life, and life is far along in the stages of emergence in our 3.6 billion year universe. And you compare life to even something like a star, which is an emergent phenomenon. The life in a single bacteria is as complex as probably all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. The generativity of life, the emergent generativity of this thing called life, is unprecedented as far as we know so far in the history of the universe. And we can evolve all these chains of being, what Alexander Bard calls emergence vectors, right? That one branch goes off and becomes trees, another becomes sponges, another becomes lichen, and another becomes animals, and another branch on that tree becomes primates. The branch off that becomes us, and then a branch off that becomes who knows what. And I approach this emergent generativity of the universe itself as the highest sacred of all, and that until we know that there's other such emergent vectors that have reached the same height that we have, say other civilizations on other planets, we have an unbelievable moral burden to protect our emergent vector that's reached higher than any other on our planet, because we've crossed the line of general intelligence and language. And that's why I take so seriously the dealings with our planet and our ecosystem as of the absolute first importance.
Beautiful. Jim, spoken like a man of faith. I'm
I
gonna
believe in
throw out a
emergent
question.
generativity
Yeah,
for sure.
I do too. I'm wondering if we reframed the question as under what circumstances, if any, is it helpful for individuals and societies to believe in the sacred, irrespective of, I guess we could say irrespective of whether the sacred exists, but would that resolve areas of disagreement? And specifically, I'm going to throw in a specific circumstance, the circumstance that I think is of utmost importance to Jim, the circumstance being a civilizational upgrade, a shift in our civilizational operating system.
Lehman, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I don't know if it might just circle us around to having the same discussion on slightly different terms. I would be perfectly happy to go with the sacred. My quibbles would be, um, does the possibility of engaging with it, even imaginally as an other entity, come into the definition of the sacred? I would actually think that we probably want to get beyond words like believe if we wanted to address these things in a more interesting way, because I think Jim and I are both more interested in practices and setups that produce experience rather than beliefs that people hold. Right. So like what gives people the actual experience of the sacred, not whether they think the sacred exists or not.
Yeah, yeah. In my take, I'm happy to go with the sacred, so long as we think of it as a signal that we can't use reductionist analytical methods to engage, at least not solely, and that we have to think intuitively and high dimensionally and open up the brain that we have evolved on for 3.5 billion years. You're going to get serious about it. To use some intuitions and some feelings, even. Oh my God, feelings on how we interact with the things that we hold to be sacred. And to something I think Stephanie said earlier, that while the ecosystem, the world, nature, life is one thing we hold sacred, there's other things I think we hold sacred. I think the way we treat each other is a sacred thing and is not fully reductionistic. And that if we open ourselves up to our intuition and our heart energy, we'll deal with each other far better than if we deal with each other instrumentally. What can I get out of you, rather than what can we be together? And that is not analytical. That is our animal nature, our intuitive nature. I can go so far, at least in it. Now, in terms of reifying it into a person or thing, let me try this move. See what you think, layman. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of holonics. The idea that systems are built from lower level things that are organized in some way to other things that include those, etc. So I'm willing to say, for instance, that the natural world can be thought of as a high-level holon, which contains a whole bunch of other things that are engaged in a very complex dynamical system, which result in, let's call it, our natural world, meaning both living and non-living, includes the water and the rain and the rocks and the minerals. And if you want to call that holon God, that's just a different name as far as I'm concerned. Now, that's not far from Spinoza and Einstein, right? Who basically held that something like that top level holon of at least the earth, and maybe in Einstein's case, the universe was their God. So if you want to call the top level holon God, I'll just call it the top level holon and we can agree, but just have different names.
Sure, I'm very happy with different names on that, and I think my position is pretty close to the Spinoza-Einstein position. In what you were just saying there, two things in the way I normally think about this came up for me. One is if you kind of draw, convergence trajectories from a whole bunch of different human values, then you get this thing that's a bit like a meta value. And you can argue about whether that meta value preceded all the values and gave them their value, or whether it's a construct that sort of synergizes the values. But I think there's some worth intellectually and emotionally in thinking about our relationship to the value that incorporates and then sort of spills over because it can barely contain the value that it has. And we can call that the sacred, or we can call that God. And when you talked about holonics, the face inside the Aztec calendar.
Hmm.
Right. I often, when I see that image, I see it as if it was a bowl, right? And I was inside a dome, and the calendar was spiraling up, and at the top of the dome was a hole, and in the hole is a face looking down. And when I think about how one holon docks inside another more inclusive holon, I imagine that that's sort of how it looks. That you see the face of the next holon looking down in your semantic register. And I think that's a great way to think about God. And there could be a holon beyond that that has the same, a similar face and a similar face fractally reiterated. If we want to call it the next bigger holon, I'm very comfortable with that.
So I think amazingly, we agree. Just have different names for it.
Well, all right. Well, then in that case, we're gonna move on to the last phase of our anti-debate. I'm curious if there are, yeah, we'll see. There might still be areas of disagreement, but we're gonna just start the last phase with a question that Jim is going to love, and that is, how are you feeling right now? Layman, we're gonna start with you so that you can show Jim how it's done. So, Layman, how are you feeling? Are you noticing any sensations in your body? What's going on in there for you right now?
I think I'm happier and more relaxed than when we started this. I feel a kind of upwelling in my chest and a kind of extra unforced grin on my face. If you were, it's not quite to the extent that you would depict me as beatific in an ancient painting, but it's got a little bit of that. I think that we've invoked God together, and maybe we're a little bit transfigured and irradiated by whatever shared spirit's going on here. I'm having a great time.
Great. All right, Jim, how are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling a kind of what seems like contradictory, but I don't think they are, both relaxed and excited. I prepared for this fairly heavily, right? And so I was in that fairly, mentally trained preparatory stage, right? And but then once we hopped into it, I got into it, and I became naturalized to it, and I relaxed, and I kept getting more and more just going with the flow. So I was, not in hyper prep mode, but just kind of, freelancing and just going with it, as what Jordan Hall would call real thinking rather than simulated thinking. I think we had some of that. We had some of that for sure in this conversation. But at the same time, I'm excited for two reasons. One is the prep forced me to formally deal with my thoughts with respect to this question, right? I've never actually sat down and, Layman's written his 25-page paper, he's really thought this through. I never have. I just kind of make shit up as I go along, right? But this time it forced me to write down pages and pages of shit about what I thought. And then further, this conversation has modified them to some degree and has opened my thinking up a bit. And I find that exciting, and I may revisit these questions more. So at the end of this conversation, I'm much more relaxed, but I'm also more excited than I was coming in.
All right, nice. Well, with that, we are going to move towards closing statements. I'm going to give us all a minute of quiet contemplation, just also for listeners, so you can reflect on how you're feeling and what you've learned. And then Jim and Layman, for you to prepare your closing statements, including what you learned. So, yeah, 1 minute. Here we go. All righty. Time for closing statements. So, one at a time, Jim and Layman, you will each have the opportunity to give your closing statement, including whether or how this conversation expanded or complexified how you think about when belief in God is warranted or belief in the sacred, or how you would think about that question now. So, Jim, let's this time start with you. You have 4 minutes. The floor is yours.
Doubt I'll use 4 minutes. First, I want to thank you, Stephanie, for a very innovative technique here, which I would declare worked. I felt like it was worth the time, and I would even say it's maybe worth the time of the listeners. We shall see. But as a participant, it was time well spent. So congratulations on a good format. With respect to how my views have changed or evolved, I kind of doubt that anytime soon I'm going to start using the G word, right? It still carries too much negative baggage for me. You know, the Aztecs cutting the hearts out of 100 teenagers a week to keep the sun shining, the Carthaginians throwing infants into the fire to placate their god Tophet, you know, the early modern Christians killing hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women, on charges of witchcraft, the Hindus burning widows alive on their husbands' funeral pyres, you know. However, one of the things I discovered here, and I sensed it probably, that what Layman is calling God is something that I can identify with, and I can see its benefits. I still think it's dangerous to call it God because it reifies it beyond what it actually is, and correlates it with these other horrors. You know, as Voltaire said, if they can get you to believe absurdities, they can get you to commit atrocities. So, you know, Layman had a nice little riff on seems, versus faith or belief. And I've had numerous conversations with seriously religious people, and they'll always say, "What about faith?" And I go, "Yeah, faith. That's what leads to massacres and genocide, right?" And so, no, homie, don't do faith. And faith and thinks faith is very, very dangerous. But to the degree that we can think about the numinous, the God-shaped whole, in a naturalistic way, as a way of relating to the stack of holons, which constitutes our reality, then I'm good with it. I just won't give it quite that name.
All
The end.
right. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Layman, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't grow up with as much baggage around the word. Um, I didn't have a lot of dogmatic or religious friends or receive much indoctrination, and so I think I don't overly associate it with a lot of traditional meanings, and that gives me a certain liberty to play, but also a certain distance from some of the traditional discourses around God. Whether it's more dangerous to use the word because it might get conflated with the repressive, horrific, and genocidal forms of mythic manipulation of human beings. I'm not totally sure about that. I think about this South Park episode where Cartman went into the future, and in the past, Richard Dawkins had converted everyone to atheism. And when Cartman arrives in the future, they unfreeze him, and the world has become a nuclear wasteland between people who believe they have the one true atheism. So I feel like that problem can reassert itself using almost any language. And I think God is a word that does offer us the chance to connect to and try to understand the thinking of some very interesting and deep and rich, complex human individuals who preceded us. So it's a useful thing in that term. And it's a useful thing sometimes in just the politics of negotiating with people who can't get outside of that language. Generally, I think this didn't necessarily change my views, but maybe tweaked the spirit of my views to go through this anti-debate process. I agree with Jim that it was really positive and productive and so much better experientially and where we ended up than 90% of all the debates I've ever been in it. I think we're both saying that it's important to be um, based in reason and natural science and skepticism, but also remain open to having intelligent people think together about the value of the numinous, and that all is something that we can't really do well unless we can get beyond traditional definitions and really superficial layers of disagreement.
Sweet. Well, Jim and Layman, congratulations on an anti-debate that I think we all won. I mean, for me, I'm walking away with yeah, just a sense of how meaningless a lot of the data is there on the correlation between, because what we're talking about is not religion that it just spans way too much. What we're actually talking about is I still don't know exactly what to call it, numinous, sacred, but it's not asking people whether they believe in God or not, and then gauging their behavior doesn't capture what we're actually talking about. It's actually hard to think of another word or concept that has such a big delta in like what we take it to mean, and then we try to like research it, but it just includes way too many different things that don't actually capture what I think you two are talking about. So yeah, I think I guess I'm just wanting to kind of specify what I mean for myself as I go forward and use this concept or use the word. And I don't know what I would use instead, but it's something that, yeah, I'm going to I want to think about what I mean and then be careful what word I choose to then use. So that can be clear to other people what I mean. So, yeah, so thank you both. Thank you to our listeners, which hopefully include some future anti-debate posts. Thank you to Common Era for the generous support to create the anti-debate. And may we all go forth with greater faith, not necessarily in God, but in our capacity to co-create a more comprehensive understanding of reality. Thank you. And stop recording. Okay.